So I think people are slowly waking up to realize that, hey, Hinduism is more than what how it's represented in pop culture or in the media
Mm.
or wherever it might be. And so I think social media is a big hand in that. And I also think among Hindu youth, those of us who have woken up to how beautiful Hinduism is and have woken up to saying this is our ancestral faith tradition and we need to preserve it and we need to further it by sharing what it's done for us and how it can empower us to live our lives even in a changing world.
Namaste, everyone. My name is Akhilesh Reddy Chopra, the host of Chai Chats. Today, I'm honored to introduce to you all a dear guest, Ishaa. Ishaa is completing her final year of her undergraduate studies at the University of Minnesota as a marketing student. She, alongside 8 other college students, founded the social media platform called Shanti Sisterhood, the global Hindu women's community platform that aims to create a network of Hindu women across the globe and spread awareness on topics ranging from advocacy, knowledge, cultural festivities, history, as well as the understanding and connection to Devi Shakti, which is a key theme to their work. Ishaa's work in developing Shanti Sisterhood's strong social media presence while inculcating pride and love for Hinduism has touched thousands of youth around the world, as well as myself, and I'm honored to have you on today. Welcome to Chai Chats, Ishaa.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
We're so excited to have this conversation with you. And as we were just speaking offline, um, I want to tailor today's conversation around the rekindling and reconnection that youth are having with their ancestral roots in this day and age, while also exploring the origins of Shanti Sisterhood. But before we get to that part of the conversation, I want to rewind back a couple of years into your early years and learn more about your Sanatan and Hindu journey. I remember you had mentioned to me offline that you were born in the US. And as part of the Hindu diaspora, it's a common theme that often, like more often than not, we grow up with these dual identities, sometimes battling or questioning which culture or community group we identify more with. For myself, I definitely felt that in facing questions like, how Hindu or how Canadian do I need to portray myself to the world? And so my question for you is, what was your childhood upbringing like? If you ever faced that dual identity complex, as well as how prominent was the practice of Hinduism in your household?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's a really good point, that dual identity. I think that's something like every child of immigrants, especially, has had to deal with on some level. And so I grew up in Minnesota in a town that was very white, and there were not a lot of children of color, and like not Indian, Black, Chinese, whatever it might be. There just wasn't a big presence at all of any communities of color. And so it was definitely difficult for me just to navigate being from this different culture and being different. So on one level, there was being a girl with brown skin. And then on another level, there was also being someone who's not Christian and is specifically Hindu. And so I remember in my elementary school, people would be like, why do you have monkey gods? Why do you have a blue skin god?
Yeah.
Because that was, which I mean, is true. We have Hanuman, right, who is portrayed as a monkey god in a way, right? So
Yes.
it wasn't necessarily always coming from a place of hate, but it was more just people making fun or being ignorant about
Yeah.
Hindu tradition. And so I grew up in a household where my parents are my mom specifically is more spiritual. We didn't do a lot of the religious practices, so I didn't grow up going to a lot of pujas or anything. But I did grow up reading the Bhagavad Gita, learning about Hindu stories, Hindu
Yeah.
itihas from my parents, and so I grew up with a very strong spiritual and also scriptural basis,
Mm.
not as much with the actual traditions, which is something that I've been trying to learn now because it's important to me. But yeah, so I definitely grew up practicing and believing Hindu. And so I would do my best to explain to students at school that, this is why, this is the story behind
Yes.
it. And, kids, they want to learn, but also there's a lot of fear of the unknown, and there's fear of
Hmm.
those who are different from you. So I did on occasion try to kind of hide those aspects of myself because I wanted to fit in and because I wanted to blend in with the other kids and I wanted to be seen as American like they were. So it was a battle for sure. And that's kind of why my family decided to move to India when I was 10. So we moved there for a
Gotcha.
couple of years. The main reason was like my parents didn't want my sister and I to feel so lost, and they didn't want us to hate ourselves and to hate where
Wow.
we came from, to hate our journeys, our ancestral journeys. So
Mm.
that was really what prompted us to move so we could rekindle that awareness of our culture, heritage, and religion.
Yes. Oh my goodness, I completely resonate with your story. For myself, even I grew up not extremely, quote unquote religious. Like same with us, we didn't do a lot of the um pujas or the celebrations, but with my mom, we would like she was more of our guru at home who would provide the teachings and sort of provide that understanding of Hindu spirituality. So I completely resonate with what you're saying, and it's the stories that hit us the most as children, when we're even reading regular storybooks, to have these kinds of epics within
Mhm.
our own culture really sets the sort of foundation for what we can build off of in later years. And it's amazing to see the relationship that you have with your mom in, reading the Bhagavad Gita and having, I guess, those key values translate into your everyday life. And that brings me to my next question of, um, along your journey from living in the States, moving to India, um, what were some of the values that were passed down to you from your family?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest one was just having that respect for your elders.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of it was kind of like listen to your elders or listen to the wisdom that they have, especially with like grandparents or extended family as well. And, growing up, we take our parents for granted. I feel like, especially in the newer generations, we're kind of like, why should we listen to them?
Yeah.
But they obviously have so much to offer. And so, like, moving to India really helped me because we were closer to my extended family as well
Mm.
in proximity. So I was able to like hear stories from my grandparents. And my aunt really, she's a very devout Hindu, and so she would tell me a lot about her practices and about her stories. And so getting those connections with my elders and with family was amazing, and that was probably the best part of moving to India, was being able to
Yes.
be close to family, because I think that's a big value in not only Indian and Hindu culture, but in most like Asian or Eastern cultures.
So true.
Connection to your family and connection to your elders is huge. And I think that's a value that can be missing in Western society. And it's something that I
Mm.
want to pass down to my children someday as well.
Yes. Oh, 100%. And um, it's interesting because I think a huge part of Hindu culture is valuing knowledge, right? And knowledge comes from all forms, shapes, whatever you have it, right? So um, it's really when we think of our ancestors, the rishis that passed down the knowledge and how knowledge gets passed down from generation to generation, there's that respect that's tied to it. And so I think from a deeper level, even when we receive information from our parents and from our grandparents, it comes from that place of that knowledge that they're carrying with them is coming from their own ancestors, right?
Mhm.
And I think that part is just so beautiful to me. And I think I'm also curious about, your journey um, with Hinduism or with Sanatana Dharma. Did that change? I know you just mentioned, wanting to practice more of the traditions and practices. I'm curious to know just a bit more about your journey connecting with Hinduism later on in life.
Yeah, I mean, later on in life, I would say a lot of it has started through social media and
Mm.
through the internet, which I mean, I think the internet can be really harmful in a lot of ways, but it's also really opened up these resources to us to be able to learn about traditions that are not necessarily in our families, or traditions
Yeah.
that our parents didn't carry on or weren't a part of their traditions. We're able to learn so much. So for me, it's like the starting point is always the Bhagavad Gita because that's where how I was raised and what I was raised on. So
Mm,
starting with that, I feel like the Bhagavad Gita can be applied in so many different ways, and sort of like how Arjuna has this task in front of him where he has to overcome
yeah.
such a huge, huge dilemma. That
Mm,
just using that wisdom for me, it's something that I can apply in every aspect of whatever I'm learning. So I've really just started digging into different forms of Hinduism too, about like Shakti traditions,
yeah.
about Shiva traditions, and everything is connected, right? There's like a thread of connection between all of these different traditions,
Yeah.
which to me is the beautiful part of it. So just like mainly I listen to podcasts, whether it's about Vedanta or if it's about Shaktism, whatever the different tradition is, just listening to podcasts, reading articles, following accounts, even taking some like online courses. There's a
Wow.
organization called the Vimarsha Foundation, and
Mhm.
so they do a lot of amazing courses for very low costs and some free courses too about some Hindu scriptures and texts.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's just been a really great way to expand my knowledge and we're living in this world of Maya, right? It's an illusion, it's a meaningful illusion, but it's still an illusion. And so it's kind of about transcending that. And so at this point, I'm really doing my best to use all the tools that I can find and use every single way to kind of challenge my interpretations of the world
Mm.
and move on to that higher plane someday, which is the goal.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of Hinduism is that we have almost an infinite number of ways of reaching the divine. You have the different kinds of traditions, Shaktiism, Shivaism, and even, if one wants to follow the Bhakti tradition, the devotion, or wants to follow the Advaita, the philosophical, I love how Hinduism holds a space for everyone to find their own connection because I think um, at the end of the day, it's that individual process, right? It's one's own individual journey to um, realize their true selves, right? I'm curious because with Shanti sisterhood, you have said in the past that Devi Shakti is a prominent theme or a pillar to the platform.
Mhm.
So I want to ask you, for folks that are unfamiliar, what does Devi Shakti represent, as well as how has she empowered your own life?
Yeah. So for me, in my limited understanding, because I am a lifelong learner and really just starting out on my journey, there's so much to learn. But for me, from what I've learned so far, it's Devi Shakti is really the goddess or the feminine principle of the creation of the universe. And so in our Hindu history and in our conception of the world, we think of the divine as masculine, feminine, androgynous, neither, none, everything.
Yeah.
It's so contradictory, but it sort of shows that none of these identities actually mean everything at the end of the day. But in we say that God is formless, but we of course will give God form so that we can relate and so that we can identify with God. So I think of Devi Shakti as that feminine way or the female
Mhm.
form, the way of relating to the divine. And so I I do feel that every person has like the masculine and feminine
Yeah.
portions of them or parts of them, and that's how it's taught to us as well. But I also have seen in a lot by from a lot of Hindu gurus and a lot of the ways that it's explained, showing how women are sort of an image of Shakti and how that feminine principle can show us how we should be treating women in this world and how that feminine energy shows up differently in men and
Mm.
women.
Yeah.
And everyone has that feminine energy, but it's a different way that it shows up in women.
Yes.
And so I think having respect for women, having respect for your mother, having respect for your daughters, all of that kind of can be tied back to having respect for the goddess and having
Mhm.
respect for that feminine life force.
Yes.
And, we have a Devi, a goddess who is a goddess of menstruation, and she's depicted menstruating, which in a lot of cultures, even Indian culture today, is kind of seen as disturbing, and
Yeah.
people don't want to see that because it's seen as not appropriate or gross, right? But we know like these things are normal, and our ancestors knew that these things were
Yeah.
normal, at least on some level. So I think Devi Shakti is like the feminine life force that keeps the world in motion, and
Mm.
women sort of display that in a unique way, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yes, 100%. When I think of Hinduism, it's, we're taught that we're all one, but also in some lights, each person, and whether you're male or female or, in between, each person still has a unique thing to offer to the world. And I wanted to bring the conversation to some of the stereotypes that still exist within Hinduism among non-Hindus as well as Hindus or Indians in today's society. One thing I've heard is that sometimes Hinduism can be seen as ritualistic or archaic. But as we know it, Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma is the universal tradition which encapsulates so much more and holds space for so many paths of reaching the divine. Um, there's deeper understandings of creation, of balance, consciousness, and it provides us tools to transcend, as you mentioned, the material body. Um, and so it would very much take a lifetime to uncover, everything that Hinduism has to offer. But in this limited time that we have together, I wanted to ask you if there are any misconceptions or myths that folks have about Hinduism that you'd like to discuss or provide more awareness on.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few misconceptions, but I think one of them that's the most important is what you mentioned about how people think that it's just rituals or blind faith with no meaning. And I've seen a lot of even Indians who are born Hindu, like their parents are Hindu,
Yeah,
but they don't practice it anymore. A lot of these people are the people who are saying these things about Hinduism, which is really sad
yeah.
because if you grew up with a faith, it doesn't mean you have to practice it or believe in it, but you would hope that they would have some respect for the
Mm,
faith that their ancestors had. But
mhm.
unfortunately, a lot of people who are born Hindu don't appreciate it, especially in the diaspora. Um, I think with the rituals, what's important to remember is that, especially with like what is called idols, which is actually murtis,
Yeah,
and these things, these are all just ways to connect, right? We
yeah,
don't believe that the stone carved murti is literally God, right?
yes.
We see that as a representation of God. It's kind of like the same way with the cow or with your mother, right? Like you don't literally think the cow itself is God, but you see it as a way to connect. You see God
Yes.
in every being. You see this divine principle. And it's just, I mean, they say that Brahman is formless and, without form doesn't have a body.
Hmm.
But for human beings in our limited human consciousness, how
Yes.
can we connect with something that's formless? We don't even know what that is. We don't know how to connect with that. And so I think that's why our ancestors have come up with all of these unique ways and yes, rituals to connect with that divine
Mm,
and to bridge that gap because we are operating on this human consciousness. Where some people, I mean, some sages and very advanced rishis are beyond that, right? But the majority of us, we're here. And so we need to be
yeah,
met at our level. And we need to figure out ways to kind of transcend the limited view that's in front of us and move on to something
yes.
else. And so a lot of our rituals are just ways to connect. So you don't have to do the rituals. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do or any physical acts in order to attain the divine. But these things such as yoga and meditation are these are vessels and ways for you to reach the
Yes.
divine.
100% well said. And it sort of paints the picture of why, they say, I think there's an exact number of, 330 million Hindu gods and goddesses that exist. And it's interesting because maybe that was the number of people that existed at that time. Maybe there were 330 million people, right?
Yeah, I don't know where that came from actually. Like,
Right, right. But it brings into question like um each person has their own way of connecting with the divine. And so for some people, it might be Lakshmi or Ganesha or Saraswati that they just really connect to, if that kind of goddess or god is aligned with their nature, right? And so I think that's why I've questioned, like, maybe there were 330 million people because each individual person had a different divine being that really resonated with their inherent nature. And so now I wanted to shift the conversation towards, the organization that you began, Shanti Sisterhood. Um, and I guess I haven't even asked you what Shanti Sisterhood is, or perhaps you'd like to provide an explanation to our viewers on what Shanti Sisterhood is, as well as the motivation that you had to start the organization.
Yeah, I think for me, so what it is right now, it's essentially a virtual global network of Hindu women, and it's open to women who are exploring Hinduism, who were or were born and raised Hindu or whatever it might be. Any woman who's interested in exploring Hinduism is welcome on our platform, and we have some group chats going and things like that. So it's essentially just a way for like-minded Hindu women to connect, and it's been largely, I would say, around high school age to like maybe mid 30s. So it's been younger Hindu women, but we also have older women and even younger than that women on the platform. So it's
Wow.
really just a connection place for Hindu women. And so we sometimes do virtual events. It hasn't been as common lately, but we're trying to get back into that and having some Zoom meetings because it's a really good way to connect. But really, I'd say the pillars of Shanti Sisterhood are connecting. So just like speaking with each other,
Mhm.
debating topics, exploring topics. The other one is advocacy. So a lot of Hindu human rights issues around the world are not addressed. And so we like to address Hindu human rights and stand with our fellow Hindus and dharmics around the world. And also just sharing information about Hinduism, about the different paths, about some beliefs, maybe some reasonings behind why we do things a certain way,
Mhm.
and just creating a space for learning. So it's really just a global connection platform, and we're hoping someday it could expand to be in person and doing things in person and traveling and things like that in the future would be a
Yes.
possibility. And I think the main thing that really inspired me to start it is I had connected with some other Hindu women or Hindu American women across the country who were all in college. And we were talking about how Hinduism is often represented as nothing more than caste or the negative social influences and, cow worshiping and
Yeah.
curry. Like that's the stereotype is
Yeah.
like caste, cows, and curry, right? And that's what people think of Hindus and because of that about Indians. And so, something that these women and I talked about is how do we show people how vast our traditions are? And how do we show other Hindus who are growing up being taught to believe that Hinduism is nothing more than evil casteism and just this evil force that should be blamed for everything that's negative in
Mm.
South Asia
Yeah.
versus all of the beautiful things about Hinduism and all of the ways that Hindus have suffered historically and
Yeah.
in certain parts of the world still do suffer, right? And everything is nuanced. I think a lot of the time, what my friends and I were seeing is people would accuse you of being you whether it's I don't know right wing or they'd accuse you of
Yeah.
supporting a certain government or they would accuse you of things that you never said just for being proud to be Hindu or for
Mm.
standing up for Hindus and
Yes.
Hindu rights in countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan.
Yeah.
And so for us, for myself and these 8 other Hindu American women, it was kind of like we want to control the narrative about Hindus the best that we can. It's
Hmm.
not fair that only non-Hindus or rather people who don't practice Hinduism are controlling the narrative about us.
For
And so it
sure.
was really reclaiming the narrative and connecting with each other and being able to find people who felt the same way that we did about the beauty of Hinduism. So it
Mm.
was really just intended to be a way for people to connect with each other and a way for us to get the word out about our traditions. And I think it's evolved into even more than that, which is great.
it brings me to one of the main topics of this conversation, which is around um, that reawakening and reconnection that youth are having with their Sanatan roots. At least for me, I've seen that huge wave of youth delving into the deeper meanings and philosophies, but also I've seen Hindu youth like yourself motivating other Hindu youth to know themselves and their history.
Mhm.
Um, it's more than just taking what we've learned from our parents and previous generations, but to see youth like you and me, even folks that are younger than ourselves,
Mhm.
take that initiative and interest to learn about where we come from. Um, and so I guess my question for you is, in this day and age, why do you think we're seeing more and more youth go back to their Sanatan and Hindu roots? And perhaps if you could also draw from your own lived experience as a Hindu youth living in today's world.
Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with social media presence and how now I think people are, or Hindus and Hindu accounts and pages are being more vocal about busting myths around Hinduism, being more vocal about sharing a lot of the amazing, vast traditions. I mean, there's so much theory, right? There's so much
Yeah.
theoretical analysis you could do. You can't even do it all in a lifetime because there's so many different traditions. And within each tradition, there's so much writing, so much to be practiced,
Yes.
so much to be experienced. And so I think people are slowly waking up to realize that, hey, Hinduism is more than what how it's represented in pop culture or in the media
Mm,
or wherever it might be. And so I think social media is a big hand in that. And I also think among Hindu youth, those of us who have woken up to how beautiful Hinduism is and have woken up to saying, this is our ancestral faith tradition and we need to preserve it and we need to further it by sharing what it's done for us and how it can empower us to live our lives even in a changing world. I think a lot of us have become more bold and not afraid of being silenced and not
yeah.
afraid of being judged by others. I think I've noticed myself as well caring less and less about what people who are acting in bad faith think, right? So my thing is I know what I believe in and I know where I stand. And so somebody labeling me for being a proud Hindu isn't going to bother me. But I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it would have bothered me, or even 1 year ago. Like I've grown in that regard. And so I think when you connect with like minded Hindus who are who have, progressive values, and I don't mean necessarily politically, but just progressive values who stand for inclusion, who stand for positive social change. And so just learning it is possible to want to preserve tradition and to want to further our traditions while simultaneously saying there are things that our ancestors did that we don't like and that we're not proud of, and we want to change these things. And so I think just these conversations being out in the open and having Hindu youth be proud of who we are is it's a
Mhm.
ripple effect. And I was inspired by other Hindu youth who I was seeing being proud of who they are. And that's what made me wake up. And I think that's sort of why people are starting to understand, if they can do it, I can do it too.
Yes. I think that's a such a key phrase that you said, if they can do it, I can do it too, because um, I think a huge part of that is having just that representation. I remember, like, even 10 years ago on looking at TV shows, there wouldn't be any Hindu representation. And if there were, it would sort of, we would have been seen in this negative light as, cow worshippers, or just, folks with, millions of gods, and just,
Mm-hmm.
the disarray or disorganization. But I think, um, especially I'm I'm happy to see, or I'm happy to know that the Hindu person that's born into the world today will have that representation and will see and be inspired by folks like yourselves in wanting to know more about themselves, right? I think representation is a key aspect in what we see is sort of what we imbibe in our day-to-day lives as a young person, right? And then as we grow older, once we have that foundation to start off of, then that gives us almost the motivation or the courage to then learn more about ourselves and our past. Um, But on one hand, we have social media as this gateway into um, years and years and lifetimes of knowledge. Um, I wonder, how important is it for us to have the cultural and historic competence? You know, what I, tell people is that there's always a spiritual or scientific reason behind why we have different forms of puja, or for example, why we have millions of devas and devis. Um, Social media allows us to tap into this knowledge, but I wonder if on the opposite side of that coin, where the understandings and the depths of those understandings can be diluted. So back to the initial question, how important do you believe it is to have that cultural and historic competence in scripture, Sanskrit, traditional sciences, as well as even, the persecution of our communities in continuing our traditions and practices into the future?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And that is something with social media is I think we need to be conscious of the fact that we have to move beyond it as well. And just scrolling through Instagram or TikTok, it could be a starting point for you to say, okay, this tradition seems really interesting and I want to
Yeah.
learn more. But just looking on Instagram or TikTok isn't going to give you that connection and it's not going to give you a full understanding. It's often very superficial. So, reading actual scriptures is, I think, really important. And for me, I have not learned Sanskrit yet, but that's something that I really want to do.
Mm,
So for me, reading scriptures or rather like commentaries from Hindu gurus
yeah.
in English is what I do right now. But even with that, you need to make sure you find a good
Yeah,
translation and
for
not
sure.
somebody who has ulterior motives, whether it's a political motive or whatever it is for translating a text in a certain way, which
Yeah.
is more common than you'd think. So I think it's important to look beyond social media and actually look at scriptures and look at what, our ancestors and what Hindu sages have said. And I think
Yeah.
reading their commentaries is very useful because a lot of our scripture is so symbolic. It's really difficult to understand without a guru and without somebody sort of illuminating that way. And so I think
Hmm.
reading commentary is a really good way to stay in touch. But yeah, I think looking at history is so important. One thing for me during my time with Shanti Sisterhood, something that the people in the organization with me and I had been grappling with is the issue of casteism and
Yeah.
how casteism is a serious problem in all South Asian communities. But myself being a Hindu, I see how it has been a problem in the Hindu community as well. And while I don't think that it's fair to say that Hinduism is irredeemably casteist or is inherently casteist, I think we need to be honest about the fact that there has been and is casteism in our communities.
Hmm.
And so, one way that we can sort of remedy this is to look at history. And so, looking at history, I have found a lot of, Dalit Hindu saints from the past who overcame this societal sort of suppression and overcame this violence against them, who said no, bhakti is for everyone. And so
Hmm.
looking at movements like the bhakti
Yeah.
movement, which wasn't one organized movement, it was sort of sporadic in different places. And a lot of these saints were women, a lot of them were Dalits, a lot of them were from historically marginalized communities. And so looking at that as an example and saying, if you see somebody acting in a casteist way today, they are not practicing the kind of Hinduism that I believe in, and they're not
Yeah.
practicing the kind of Hinduism that we want our future to hold. And so I think
Hmm.
it's important to look at history to learn about past struggles and also examples of how people have fought against those odds and people have won.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And um, you mentioned going back to the writers or the authors of the scripture, right? And to see exactly as you said, past examples of where um, caste wasn't a barrier to reaching whatever true potential that person had, I think is really key. I wanted to ask you if you could recommend to our audience any resources or books or podcasts that you found really helpful within your spiritual journey.
Yeah, I think for sort of a Vedanta perspective, I really like the Chinmaya Mission podcast called
Mm,
Vedanta Speaks. I think that's
yeah.
what it's called. It's a great podcast where the host sort of breaks down Hindu concepts, specifically about the Bhagavad Gita, sort of breaks them down and talks about them in ways that we can apply to our modern lives, which I think is really helpful because it can be so hard to read a scripture that was written thousands of years ago and say, how do I live this today? Or how do
Yeah,
I apply this in my life today? I'm not on a real battlefield, but you are, right? The mind is the battlefield. So
exactly.
I think, yeah, the Chinmaya Mission podcast is a really good one. I think just reading sort of the lives of Hindu gurus, Swami Vivekananda, of course,
Mm,
just a lot of these figures reading books from their disciples is something that I really like. With Anandamayi Ma, one of her disciples wrote a book about her life, which I read recently. It was very inspiring. So I would say if you come across something on social media, say it's a quote from Vivekananda, like look into that and look into an authentic source where you can learn more about what he meant when he said a certain quote, or how did he live his life and how did he say you should live your life. So really just looking for those authentic sources and doing the research
yeah.
instead of just stopping at reading a post. Because reading a post can be great and it's a good start, but we need to go deeper than that.
Yes. Yes. And finally, a question that I usually conclude with my chai chat conversations is, um, what can youth do in this globalized and rapidly changing, generation to carry forth our traditions and way of life?
Yeah, I mean, I would say start with knowledge, start with always seeking, always learning. That's something that's a core Hindu value is not to just sit down and say, I know everything because you don't know everything. Just constantly expanding your horizons, learning, listening to new perspectives, studying our scriptures. I would say this is hypocritical because I haven't done it yet, but learning Sanskrit, of course. And I'm holding
Perfect.
myself to that. Check in with me in like a year or so and say, have you started? But yeah, I would say just doing your best to read scripture, to learn from gurus who, I mean, it's hard to tell sometimes who's authentic and who's not. But I think once you do enough research and read enough and listen to some trusted people that it's easier to discern who's authentic and really just constantly learning and sharing with others. And if you see someone sharing something that's not true or is a misconception about Hinduism, being not being afraid to gently but firmly call them out and challenge them and
Yeah.
say, this is your perspective, but this is mine, and to come with evidence and just not be shy to express how you feel as a proud Hindu and not be shy to share what you believe in.
Mhm.
Something that for Shanti Sisterhood, I got a lot of motivation from some other religions groups that I'd been seeing. There were some Muslim women groups, I saw a Jewish women's group, and there's a lot of Christian groups as well, or sort of like youth groups for churches. And a lot of other religions have that connection with each other that I felt was missing in the Hindu diaspora.
Yeah.
And so I would say connect with other people who are interested in Hinduism and just find a way to bridge those gaps with the people around you. Don't be afraid to call out misinformation.
Mm, a great piece of advice. And sort of, it seems like the common theme with what you said, as well as with this entire conversation, is um, having that openness and um, being able to almost critically think and question. And I think Hinduism allows for that, for that debate to always remain curious. Um, yeah, that's such a beautiful way to end this conversation. And, I've learned a lot. And, to say to the folks listening in, tuning in, to stay curious and to remain involved in the learning that they're doing. I wanted to thank you so much, Isha, for joining us on Chai Chats, for sharing with us your story in how Shanti Sisterhood came to be, as well as, your understanding and ever evolving connection with Sanatana Dharma and Hinduism. So thank you so much, Isha, for being on Chai Chats.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Awesome. I'll see you soon.
Bye.